I know how the story I'm fighting a battle you've already won. No matter what comes my way, I will overcome. Don't know what you're doing, but I know what you've done. I'm fighting a battle you've already won.
Has there ever been a time in your life when it seemed like God was absent? Maybe you were in a time of crisis and it seemed like God was not answering your prayers. Maybe it was a situation when you felt like things could not possibly get worse, and then they did. Or how about you chose to do the right thing and at best no one noticed or cared, or worse, you got persecuted for doing the right thing. And at a crucial time, it seemed like God was absent. He wasn't doing anything, not anything that you wanted him to do anyway. Maybe you're in one of those scenarios right now. And if you are, I want to suggest to you that what you're experiencing right now is not unique to you. And it's not new either. See, the book of Esther, which we've been studying for the past 6 weeks, is a record from 2,500 years ago that stands in opposition to the kind of hopelessness that those life scenarios can tempt us into. The book of Esther is an account that affirms, even when it seems like God is absent, he is always working. And the amazing thing is, this book, as we've already said before, never once mentions the name of God, but his fingerprints are everywhere. On every event that happens, his providential hand is guiding all things, including what seems to be the meaningless life of a Hebrew woman whose parents die and she's taken in by her older cousin. She's essentially a slave who becomes the queen of the Persian Empire. Again, even when it seems like God is absent, he's always working. And so by the time we get to the end of Esther chapter 5, which is where we landed last Sunday, Esther is grasping a consequential moment of God placing her in a position to be the advocate for her people to the king, to spare their lives, including her own life, from an evil law that would destroy, kill, and annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day. That law's already on the books by this point, and she has now arranged a meal to discuss the matter between herself, the king, and the king's right-hand man, Haman. Now, Haman is also approaching a consequential moment because he thinks there's a big day coming for him where he gets to carry out the evil law to exterminate all the Jews. But right now, he's planning on making an example out of one Jew in particular, one that refuses to bow down to him, and that's Esther's cousin and surrogate father, Mordecai. Haman plans to hang Mordecai from the gallows that he builds overnight so that when daylight comes, he can make a public example of Mordecai and strike fear in the heart of the Jews. But that's not what happens. You know why? Because even when it seems like God is absent, he's always working. So let's see how God masterfully works in Esther chapter 6. If you can, let's stand together for the reading of God's word. We will begin in Esther chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Word of God says this: On that night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And And it was found written how Mordecai had told Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in. And the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Who would the king like to honor more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" The king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing out that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, and he led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." And while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther prepared. May God bless the reading of his word. You can be seated. God's providence is something that we've talked about Sunday after Sunday in this series. And back in week 1, Pastor Mark gave us a good definition of God's providence, and I've included it on your outline this morning. Look at it with me. God's providence is his ordering and working out of every event in the universe at every moment. That's a good definition. And a good way to remember what God's providence is to start with the root word of providence, which is provide. In Latin, it's providence. Pro meaning to or toward, vide meaning see. So you put them together and you've got to see in the sense of to see to something. Give you an example of what I'm talking about. Whenever my family members have an issue with the internet or their devices, they come to me to help fix it. And as a dad, my response is, "I'll take care of it. I'll see to it." That's provide, to provide. See, God's providence is all about how he cares for and provides for everything in all of creation. And in his providence, there's proof that he's not absent. The absence of God is a lie. He is not absent, he is provident, always at work. And we see that, number 1, in the king's important discovery. First on your outline is the king's important discovery. The first verse reveals that the king could not sleep. The same night that Haman started building the gallows, the king just can't seem to fall asleep. Anybody in there ever had a night like that, like you could not fall asleep? Yeah, a bunch of us. Me too. I dealt with insomnia several months my junior year in college, and it was just awful. See, we're designed as finite creatures by our Creator to go to sleep every night. And when we don't, something physiological or neurological or maybe even emotional may be out of whack. But even so, God is still at work. His providence is also over our sleepless nights. Brothers and sisters, this is a good time to remember that God is sovereign over every cell in our body, the ones that are healthy and the ones that are not. And any challenge that we have with our brains or our body is a challenge that falls under the providence of God. For those who belong to him, God is never absent in any health struggle that we go through. And let me just encourage those of you who are parents of younger kids. When you have a sleepless night, use that opportunity to pray over your kids. When our boys were little, there would be nights that I couldn't sleep. And because I believe God is sovereign, I'm awake for a reason, gotta be, right? So why not go into their room, kneel by their bed, and quietly pray for them? It's a providential opportunity. But what do we normally do when we have a sleepless night? Get a book, a big one. Start reading and hope we fall asleep, right? That's what the king wanted to do. In verse 1, he calls for the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles. See, at this time, Persian kings kept extensive records of the significant events that took place in their kingdom. And by this point, Ahasuerus has been king for 12 years. So that's a lot of scrolls recording a lot of events in the kingdom. And out of all those scrolls, he reads from the one about something Mordecai did years ago. How about that? What are the odds? Now remember, we don't know why the king couldn't sleep. Was he thinking about his conversation earlier with Esther? Or was it something that was stressing him that was going on in the kingdom? We don't know. And those things might be secondary causes, but I hope you do realize that there's an ultimate cause as to why the king cannot sleep, and that's the Lord himself. God is always working towards his purposes, and specifically in the book of Esther, his purpose here is to preserve his people and to spare them from this massacre that's about to happen. On this particular night, the king was awake, and so was God. In fact, God never falls asleep, does he? Psalm 121 begins this way: I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He keeps you and will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. Friends, even on a sleepless night, God is at work, constantly working for his purposes. And so instead of falling back to sleep, the king hears the reading of the scroll, and it's about the plot of two of his own guards mentioned here in verse 2, and they wanted to kill him. See, at the end of Esther chapter 2, which we looked at a few weeks ago, Mordecai found out about this plot to kill the king, and he shared it with Esther, and Esther shared it with the king. And they stopped the assassination attempt. And Bigthan and Teresh, they were executed for that. So now reading the scroll, it jogs the king's memory about this attempt. So in verse 3, he asked the question, look at it with me. What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? He's asking, how has Mordecai been rewarded for his heroic deed? The king's question in verse 3 here assumes that something had been done. But the problem is nothing had been done to honor Mordecai for this. Mordecai saved the king's life, and he was not acknowledged in what he did. You ever done something kind for someone, and it never was acknowledged? Do you work really hard in your job, but no one affirms that? Day in and day out, you fulfill your responsibilities. And it's like no one even notices, much less says thank you. Friends, there's always someone who notices. And he's not just passively standing by watching. He's actually at work in what you're doing. In his providence, God guides our steps each and every day. And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul explains to the church at Philippi how that works when he said this: for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. See, a Christian does the right thing. A Christian serves faithfully, not to be acknowledged or thanked, but for the pleasure of God. Because when we do something honorable, God is actually at work in us as we do what we do. That's stunning when you think about it. Consider this, over the previous 5 years, Mordecai could have just thrown in the towel because he thought God was absent and nobody cared about his heroic deed. But that's not what he did. He trusted that God was at work, even though he could not see yet what God was doing. Brothers and sisters, this is why Galatians 6:9 tells us, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. God is not absent. He's at work in sleepless nights. He's at work in our faithful service that no one sees. He's at work in our kindness, our acts of kindness that no one will ever acknowledge. And he was at work in the king's important discovery here. He's also in work, number 2 on your outline, in Haman's ironic duty. Haman's ironic duty. Now, the fact that no recognition had been given to Mordecai, that prompts the king to ask the question in verse 4. Look at it with me. He says, who's in the court? Meaning, where's one of my guys that can get something done because something needs to be done to honor Mordecai? And lo and behold, guess who is outside the king's bedchamber in the outer court? Guess who's eagerly waiting that morning to get an audience with the king? Haman. What are the odds? Haman's been up all night building the gallows, and he wants to be the first one to see the king that morning because he wants to request that Mordecai be the beta test for those gallows. So when the king asks who's in the court, the servants say, Haman's there. And the king says, come on in. And friends, this is just another example of the many moments in this passage and the entire book of Esther where you and I could say, how about that? What an amazing coincidence. What an interesting twist of fate. Kind of bad luck for Haman. Or as people would say today, this is instant karma. You know what the truth is? It's none of those things. It's not a coincidence. It's not fate. It's not luck. It's certainly not karma. It's the providence of God. Don't miss what's going on here, friends. God is using the sinful motives of a bloodthirsty man who wants to kill Mordecai and all the Jews in Persia, and God is using that man for the good of his people. Let that sink in. And this is not new in the book of Esther. We've seen it before, that God's plans are not hindered by the sinful motives or actions of other people. Haman has been placed by God right where he is, just at the right time, according to God's wise purpose. Sadly, some of us lose way too much sleep because we worry about other people's motives and actions. We have very little control over other people's motives and actions. You know why? Because God does. That's his purview, not ours. And what we see here is God's providence in action, guiding an evil man to accomplish the will of the Lord. And if you do not believe that God can use evil people with evil motives to accomplish his purpose, I respectfully submit to you Exhibit A, Jesus Christ crucified on a cross. In Acts chapter 2, Peter is preaching at Pentecost. And he makes this very point when he says, men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst. As you yourself know, this Jesus delivered up, according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God uses the sinful motives and sinful actions of evil people for his purpose. And if we're not struck in awe by that, by who God truly is, we're not reading our Bibles carefully enough. And so now Haman is invited in to see the king. But the king doesn't even let Haman get a word out of his mouth about why he's been waiting to see him. King doesn't care because he's got his own agenda. And he reveals that agenda in the question that he asked to Haman in verse 6. Look at it with me. The king says to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? So let me ask you a question. Who's on the king's mind when the king is asking that question? Who? Mordecai, that's right. Who is on Haman's mind when the king asks that question? Haman is, that's right. We know that because of the question Haman asked himself in the second half of verse 6. Look at it with me. Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? I mean, come on. Haman is so self-absorbed, so prideful, that he cannot imagine that the king would be referring to anybody else in the Persian Empire except him. You know anybody like that? If you had to make a list of the top 3 most prideful and self-absorbed people, I bet you could come up with a list pretty quickly, couldn't you? Might be a fun exercise at lunch today. But has it ever occurred to you that you might be on somebody else's top 3 list? See, the sin of pride is a lot like bad breath. It's easier to detect on someone else than it is on ourselves, right? Pride is the original sin of Satan when he rebelled against God and was cast out of heaven. Pride is the original sin of Adam and Eve in the garden because they believed they knew better than God. The great reformer Martin Luther noted that pride is the sin underneath all our sins. He said the pride is the lie of the serpent that we cannot trust the love and grace of Christ and that we must take matters into our own hands. That's what Haman's about to do in verse 7, take matters into his own hands. Haman creates this elaborate honor that he thinks is coming to him. He makes a wish list in verses 7 through 10, and that includes the king's royal robes that he would wear, the king's horse that he would ride, and a noble official that would dress him and put him on the horse and trot him around the city square as they shout the royal proclamation about him. Look at verse 9 for that proclamation. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Everybody would hear that over and over and over again. This is not just a pat on the back. Haman is describing here an over-the-top recognition, and I'll tell you why. Because this is what would take place at a king's coronation. Haman wants the people of Susa to know he's ready to be king. Theologian Warren Wiersbe says of this moment, a proud man with selfish ambitions is not content to take second place if there's any way possible to secure first place. Haman wants it to be all about him. And I'm telling you, if Haman was alive today and he had an iPhone and a TikTok account, he'd fit right into this culture, right? Jesus said in Luke 18:14, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And James 4:10 is a command. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Friends, we have 2 options in life. We can humble ourselves or God will humble us. And Haman believes that God has absolutely no bearing on his life. He's living as if God is absent and does not exist. But God is at work and he's about to humble Haman. See, in God's providence, the king loves Haman's idea. Because of course he's got Mordecai on his mind to receive this honor, not Haman. So the king commands Haman in verse 10, which in my view is the pivotal moment in our passage today. Verse 10, look at it with me. The king says, hurry, take the robes and the horse as you said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew. Come again. Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Oh, and leave out nothing that you've mentioned. This is all wonderful. King essentially says to Haman, I love this idea. Now go do it. Why would that happen? Why would it be Mordecai? God's providence. In verse 11, Haman will carry out this command. He's not going to like it, but he does it. Now, verse 10 is the first time we see the king referred to Mordecai as Mordecai the Jew. And it begs the question, has the king forgotten about the edict that he authorized to kill all the Jews? He's about to publicly honor a Jewish man with a lot of pomp and circumstance. So did he forget his edict? Well, friends, if we go back to Esther chapter 3, we'll notice that when Haman made his appeal to the king about creating an edict to kill all the Jews, Haman never specified to the king who the people group was that he wanted to eradicate. He just told the king that there's a group of people that are in your kingdom and they're a nuisance and they don't obey your laws and we should not tolerate them anymore. And so the king gave his approval and his signet ring to those vague generalities. But when the edict was actually written, the group of people were specifically named in the law as the Jews. You have to pass the bill in order to know what's in it, right? I think there's a real possibility here that the king never knew who he agreed to annihilate. Now, I'm not giving him a pass, because if that's true, that's terrible leadership. But it could be one of several reasons the king presses ahead to honor Mordecai, even though he knows he's a Jewish man. And throughout history, kings do a lot of weird things for unknown reasons, which just reaffirms what we've already seen in this passage. Secondary causes can explain why things happen. But brothers and sisters, the Christian worldview affirms that there's an ultimate cause behind the secondary causes of why stuff happens, and that's the work of God. He's always at work, orchestrating all things for his glory and the good of those he redeems. And I may sound like a broken record this morning, but that's the providence of God. We've seen it in the king's important discovery. We've seen it in Haman's ironic duty. And finally, we see it in number 3 on your outline, God's own irrefutable decree. God's providence is seen in his own irrefutable decree. So, after the parade for Mordecai around the city is over, second half of verse 12 tells us that Haman hurried to his house mourning with his head covered. So he had done what the king commanded. And he's not humbled by it, he's humiliated by it. And those are two very different things. Haman wants to get home as fast as he can. And his head is covered, which was a public sign of mourning, as if someone had died. A bit prophetic. Now, why would he respond this way? Well, remember, as he led Mordecai throughout the streets, the people of Susa were not bowing to honor him, they were bowing to honor Mordecai. And for Haman, having people bow down to him matters a lot. He idolizes and is addicted to the praise of other people. And that temptation is still alive and well in 2024, as it was in 480 BC in Persia. It's what started this whole mess, actually. Think about it. Haman craves the approval of others. And so when Mordecai initially refuses to bow to him in the beginning of chapter 3, it enrages Haman. And it sets off all these events that eventually lead to people bowing down to Mordecai, while Haman holds the reins of the horse that Mordecai is sitting on. Is that ironic? No. It's God working, doing what he does on behalf of his people. And to be clear, there is no repentance in Haman here. His pride has definitely been wounded, but not repented of. And we know that because in the beginning of verse 13, he reveals his effort to sort of elicit sympathy from his friends and his wife. He tells them everything that has happened. And that's interesting because this was the same group of people who at the end of chapter 5 came up with the idea for Haman to build the gallows to execute Mordecai on. So look at what they say now in the second half of verse 13. Look at it with me. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him. In political terms, you might say they've changed their position on the Mordecai issue, right? But more importantly, this statement is a warning. It's a warning to Haman that sadly he never heeds. First, they tell Haman that his fall has begun. Don't miss that. And secondly, they say to him that if Mordecai is really a Jew, that Haman doesn't stand a chance because Mordecai is one of God's people. They say, you will not overcome him. And the word for overcome here in the Hebrew language means to be superior to. Think about that. You will not be superior to Mordecai, which is what Haman's been trying to prove this whole time, that he's superior to Mordecai, but he's not. It's not true. Brothers and sisters, no one can prevail against God's people. That was true then, still true today. And by the way, how is it that Haman and Haman's wife and his advisors know that God's people shouldn't be messed with? You ever think about that? Are they aware of the Abrahamic covenant? Are they aware of what God says to Abraham in Genesis 12:3? I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. Did they know about what the angel of the Lord said to Abraham in Genesis 22, verse 17? When he said, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. Did they know about that? I don't know. I don't know if they were familiar with God's promises to his people, but I do know that God made promises to his people, and his decrees are irrefutable. He's always working to keep his promises. Always. Haman's wife and his advisors are warning him here. But that warning is actually not coming from them. It's coming from the living God, because he will not be opposed, not without eternal consequences. See, this whole account could have turned out very differently if Haman had just heeded the warning and cried out to Yahweh for mercy and grace. But he didn't. And spoiler alert, if he would have repented, he might have just saved his own life and the life of his 10 sons, which we'll eventually get to in chapter 9. But he didn't. He stayed entrenched in his sinful pride right up until the moment that verse 14 talks about. Look at it with me as we finish. While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. And friends, we'll see that next Sunday, that moment is going to be Haman's last supper. How about you? Do you know that you have a last supper? We all do. There will come a time for every single one of us when death will knock on our door. It happened for Haman, and sadly, he wasn't ready for it. In his sinful pride, he believed he was calling his own shots. He was his own God. And instead of yielding to the one who created him, he wanted other people to yield to him. He believed that God was absent, that he himself was orchestrating the events of his life. But he was wrong. And death, unexpectedly for him, knocked on his door. And all of that was really bad news for him. But the good news for us today is that there is one God who's always present, always working, always orchestrating all things for his glory and the good of those he redeems. And he is a God who humbles those who exalt themselves, but he delights to exalt those who humble themselves. And if you're here today and you've never humbled yourself to turn from your sin and trust in Christ for salvation, we'd love to have a conversation with you about that. In just a moment at the end of our service, our Connect team members will be down front. We would love to share with you what God has done for sinners like us to be forgiven through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross.